I'm going to talk about power chords, in particular your most basic form of a power chord, which is often referred to as a fifth chord. So you see it in notation, it'll probably say, you might be used to seeing E major, A minor in your music books, your song sheets. With a fifth power chord, you'll normally see it described as E5 or A5 or G5. So it's got like the name of the chord, whatever chord it wants you to play, with a little letter 5 after it. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to drop into close-up so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. I'm going to give you a quick, I'll start off with a quick way to just be able to play the chords, a little pattern that will let you be able to get started with playing the chords. And then I'm going to follow that up with a little bit of, just a tiny bit of theory explanation as to why it's called a fifth power chord and how it actually works and the concept of the chord itself. So obviously I'll do the simple bit to get you started with. If that's all you need, fine, you can leave the rest of it. If you're interested to know more about why it's a fifth chord and how it works that way, then obviously you can carry on watching later. Before I get into that, the power chord, it's the same with bar chords as well, they're known as movable chords. Now, if you're just used to playing your normal root chords, so your A chord, your D chord, your G chord, that quite often players start off with when you start learning your chord shapes from your chord book, they're non-movable chords. And the reason for that is, I'll take my G chord for an example, that's played in that particular position for a reason. So if I start moving that chord up, and I can move the chord up and down the neck wherever I want to, but because it's got open strings in it, as soon as I start moving that chord, I'm going to have problems with some of the notes, particularly the open string notes, aren't going to fit. So if I move this up one fret at a time, my G chord shape, I'll move it all up one fret. It sounds disgusting. It doesn't sound great, but I could maybe use that with a bit of adjustment. They start to not sound right. So because the normal root chords have got open strings in, they tend not to sound right if you try and move them up and down the neck. With movable chords, so with your power chords and your bar chords, they're called movable chords. We can use the same shape all over the fretboard of the guitar and it's going to sound right. So that's the key difference between movable chords and root chords. So I'm going to go into close-up of my fretting hand, so you'll be able to see a little bit more about what I'm doing. I'll explain, as I say, a simple version of just how to form those E5, A5, G5 chords, and then I'll follow it up with why they're called that and the technical theory behind it. It's not actually that technical, but it is there anyway. So to start with, I'm going to give you the simple method of how to form basically any power chord for any note on the guitar fingerboard. So I used the example of an open G chord before, a your normal root G. That's your ordinary G chord. The key thing to bear in mind when we're looking at this G chord is we want to look at the first note of the chord. So as I strum across the chord, the first note that I'm playing is this one here. So just that note on its own. That's the first note of my ordinary root open G chord, whatever we want to call it. And that's also going to be the first note of our power chord. So whichever chord we want to play, a G, an E, A, F, B, whatever, we want to look to the first note of the chord. In this instance, it's a G that's played on the 3rd fret on our 6th string, on our E string. And that's important. Now, the formula for working out the 5th chord shape, the power chord shape, is quite simple. We've only got 2 notes that we need to play. It's a 2-note power chord. The first chord is going to be, the first note is going to be whatever the first note of our chord is, note ordinary, that's G. And the second note, in order to achieve our second note, we're going to move across a string and up 2 frets. So from our G note, we're going to move down to our next string across, our A string, and move up 2 frets. So the second and final note of our 5th power chord is going to be that one, which happens to be a D note on our A string. So we're going to have our G, and then our D there on the next string down. That's going to be the same for the 5th power chords in whatever position you want to play them in. So for A, E, I'll show the others in a second, but that's the basic formula. So we start off with our what we call our root note, and from there we move a string across and 2 frets up. So put those 2 notes together. That's our G5 power chord. If we want to do that, let's say for example, another chord that we commonly learn when we're starting off with a C chord, ordinary C chord. As I play the notes of the C chord, the first note I'm playing there is with that finger. That's the 3rd fret on my A string, that happens to be a C. And that's going to be the first note of our C5 power chord. So using the same method, we'll take that as our first note. And to achieve our second note, we're going to move a string across and 2 frets up. And that becomes our C5 power chord. So now we've got a G5, and using exactly the same shape. This finger's not doing anything, by the way, it's just in the way. A C5 power chord. If we want to play a D5 power chord, for example, I happen to know that that's a D. So again, string across, 2 frets up. That's my D power chord. If I want an A, that's an A. String across, 2 frets up. That's my A5 power chord. It also works the same when we get down to open string positions. So if we say, for example, an E minor, that's another chord that you quite often learn when you're starting off with. Simple E minor chord. That starts off with an open string, so open E string. I'm not fretting anything. Same principle. I move down to the next string, which is my A string, 2 frets up. And that's my E5 power chord. So as long as I know which chord I want to play, in that case a G, a C, a D, an A or an E as my starting note, my second note is always going to be 1 string down and 2 frets up. So that's a simple formula just to be able to get the shape to play the chords. Now, I also said I'd give an explanation as to why it's called a 5 chord or a 5th chord. There's a tiny little bit of theory involved, but it's not that complicated. You don't necessarily have to fully understand the theory aspect to it, but it revolves around the major scale. And the naming of the chord, the 5 or the 5th, means that we're playing the first note of the scale and the 5th note of the scale, and that makes up the chord. So using again the first one as an example, I started off with an ordinary open G chord. If I'm to play my G major scale, that's the first 5 notes of my G major scale. So if we look at the notes I'm playing, let's count them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The important notes are the 1 and the 5. So the 1 is my G, and the 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is up there. It's a D, and that, those 2 notes, are what we're using to form that fifth power chord. That principle of using the major scale is how well, most of the chords are named. There's some exceptions, but that's predominantly how we get the naming of all the different chords, where you see all kinds of strange names. It's based around the different numbers of the notes in that scale. In this instance, to keep it simple, we're just looking at the first note and the fifth note. And again, I'll do it with a C. That was the second example I showed you. So we'll use a C major scale. So first note is a C there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the fifth note, that's the other note that we need for our power chord. So as long as we keep that shape in our mind, 1 string down, 2 frets up, we can play that power chord anywhere we want. And because there's only 2 notes and it's a simple shape, that's one of the benefits of power chords. We can move it around the guitar quite quickly. Just a few general points to finish off with about those fifth power chords. The first thing you might have noticed, you may not have noticed, when I was playing the power chords, the fingering I was using to play them was using my first and my third finger. So I was using what's called positional play. So for the G power chord, starting off on my 3rd fret, the next note was on my 5th fret, and I was using my 3rd finger, so 1 finger per fret, if you remember from positional play. So I'm using correct positional play. The reason for that is because quite often a lot of people start learning power chords before learning full bar chords, and it's a great way to get used to playing movable chords, and they're simpler to play than full bar chords, which sometimes requires you holding down all the strings with 1 finger and making a chord shape as well. So using power chords is a good way to get started with bar chords, and for good advice on technique, by using this fingering, my 1st and my 3rd finger, it means that if I want to progress then to play a bar chord, so a G major bar chord, those fingers are the same fingering usage that I'm going to use when I progress to playing full bar chords. You might be tempted, if you've got if you're struggling with a stretch, you might be tempted to use your 1st and your 4th finger to play those bar chords. And you can do. It sounds exactly the same, makes no difference which finger you use, but from a development point of view going forwards, if you then decide to, if this is your introduction to movable chords, and you then decide to have a go at the bar chords, you're going to have to relearn the fingering again, so you're effectively learning the chord again. So my first tip is to use your 1st and your 3rd finger across the frets, because that'll help you if you come to use this as an introduction to playing bigger chords, bar chords in the future. The second thing is, because the chords are movable, you might have been used to playing your normal root chords and learning the chord names for those, so you'll associate that with a G because you've seen the shape on a chord box and little dots are where to put your fingers, and a C or a D, so you might be familiar with that. With the movable chords, it's really useful to learn, if you don't already know, the actual notes of the frets on your guitar. So as an example, starting on your E string, it's an E string, so it's an open E, and then moving up from there 1 fret at a time, an E, an F sharp, G, G sharp, A, B flat, B, C, and to know what each of those notes is, because then if someone was to say to you, or play an A5 chord, I know that's an A, I'm straight there. Play an F sharp 5, I know where my F sharp is, I'm straight there. So with movable chords, it's really useful to be able to know at least which of the notes are on your, start off with your E string, and then maybe your A string, and then you've got basically most of the power chords covered. You can play them across the other strings as well, but to get started off with, I would certainly recommend learning the notes on your E string and the A string. Finally, these chords are quite simple to play, these fifth chords, but they are not a substitute for playing the other chords, which are often more difficult to play. The reason for that is because we're only using two notes. We've only got a certain amount of musical flavour that we can put into the chord, and they do sound a little bit samey, and it's difficult to be able to imply a mood with those chords. So as an example, I'll use a D fifth chord. It's one of the ones that we did. I've got those two notes, that's it. That's my D fifth chord. Now, there's all kinds of variations of a D chord. You might have already learned a D major chord, so immediately that's got more flavour to it than the D5 chord. In the instance of that D major chord, the major chord tends to have a happier, buoyant sound to it. You might have learned a D minor chord, which tends to have a more sad, downbeat type feel to it, some people say, as opposed to a major chord, or even a D7 chord. Again, that sounds different again. Seventh chord tends to add a little bit of maybe suspense to it, as though it's wanting to resolve to the next chord. So by using the full chords, the more than the two notes, you can add a lot more feel to the music. So don't think that you can play your way through any song just by learning fifth chords as a shortcut. That's not the reason why they're there. I've done another video on why power chords are quite often used. I'll put a link for that. But they're a separate thing to ordinary root chords, major, minor, seventh, add this, add that, suspended this, augmented that. They all have a different reason for being played in the sphere of music. So they're definitely not a substitute or a shortcut to learning your proper chords. They're a separate thing on themselves, but they are very useful, both in their own context and also as an introduction to playing movable chords, including bar chords. Enjoy.